Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me for another video. I really appreciate it. Today I want to talk about leadership, and specifically why I think we're pretty bad at decision making when it comes to leaders. Today is of course general election day, in which across the country people will be choosing both their local leaders and then eventually a prime minister. The way this video is structured is that I want to spend a couple of seconds talking about the evolution of the notion of leadership and kind of where it is at today. Then I want to talk about two fundamental reasons why I think we're led to make pretty poor decisions about our leaders. And then finally, I just want to spend a minute or so comparing and juxtaposing a model of leadership put forward by Marcus Aurelius and juxtaposing that to the examples that we have in this day and age. So let's talk very briefly about the evolution of the notion of leadership. So one of the seminal pieces of work surrounding this is of course Plato's Republic, in which he introduces the notion of a philosopher king. Now, a philosopher king obviously has many descriptors that we can't go into in too much detail in this video, but one of them is his fundamental desire or her fundamental desire to consume knowledge, and as soon as they have a bit of knowledge, they want more. Now, this is interesting because it kind of alludes to a technocratic flavor in leadership that Plato clearly admires. But this is something we're very far adrift of in modern society. So, for example, technocrats are viewed with huge suspicion. If we just cast our minds back to the Brexit vote or the Trump election, we kind of see people's huge skepticism when it comes to experts and expert opinions. You had people like the IMF or the World Bank saying that certain economic consequences would happen if you make a certain decision, and people ignoring them because they thought vested interests were at play. So this is definitely something which is far adrift of Plato's conception of a philosopher king. Even more so than that, I think there's a strong case to be made that society has, in a sense, given up on the notion of a single leader or a leader being able to rectify an entire situation. The reason I say that is because the question has not so much been recently what makes a good leader, but the question is more so, what can we do to prevent a leader from messing up? And that's why we get this whole system of checks and balances, which the US is an example of, and more recently kind of what Parliament felt it needed to do when Boris Johnson was trying to ram through a version of Brexit that they didn't necessarily agree with. So you kind of have this change in paradigms. We're no longer talking about what makes a great leader, but we're talking about this entire institutional backdrop or context in which a leader should be allowed to operate. And for me, that signals a giving up on the notion of a leader, or that kind of shows a resignation that human nature will be human nature, and we kind of have to adapt around it rather than try and get the best out of it. And I think that negative mindset has kind of trickled down into us as well, as people who vote for these leaders. Another example which I think alludes to kind of what we value in leadership now is John F. Kennedy. Now, of course, if you kind of say the words John F. Kennedy, what comes to mind is charisma, what comes to mind is elegance, what comes to mind is a lot of emphatic, inspirational speeches. Now, in a sense, he is probably much more remembered than many of his contemporaries, and much better remembered than, for example, his immediate predecessor, such as Lyndon B. Johnson. And in fact, there has been some revisionism, but more or less, if you ask the average citizen or the average person who is better remembered or who do you remember more fondly, the answer is more likely to be John F. Kennedy. Now, if you think about the actual impact, throughout no fault of his own, just because of the termination of his life, he wasn't actually able to implement or kind of succeed in the policy making that he potentially would have wanted to. Whereas presidents who had much longer stints aren't as well remembered. Now, why is that? And I think the key is that society's priorities have shifted from potentially viewing impact for its own sake, which kind of had a much more tangible impact on us as human beings, to maybe something a bit more superficial, which is something that I hope to talk about when I talk about our own shortcomings as citizens of countries. So when it comes to talking about our own shortcomings, I don't want it to seem like I'm unaware of the fact that, of course, that there are elites or financially powerful institutions or corporations or people that have money or influence or status, and they kind of skew some of the things in their direction by using the resources that they have. I'm well aware that it's not always a level playing field in a democracy. But what I do want to say is that that's kind of a negative way of looking at it, because of course those things are there, but more importantly to our discussion should be the ways that we can control our decision making, or what is in our hands. And the two things that I think come to mind in terms of what we could do better is, first of all, rectifying our superficial mindset, and second of all, maybe being less selfish and deploying a lot of empathy in the decisions that we make. So when it comes to superficiality, I can think of two primary examples of instances in recent British political history which have kind of derailed people's careers. And it's kind of interesting to see how they seem very arbitrary and very momentary in retrospect, but they have an enormous impact on the way we kind of remember these figures and the way that we kind of see these figures. So for example, Ed Miliband's clumsiness was exemplified by the way he ate that sandwich. And similarly, William Hague's out-of-touchness was exemplified by the way he wore that baseball cap. Now, this is kind of a sign of the media society in which we live in, because these instances metamorphosed into these kind of interpretations of their entire character, their entire existence, and we kind of made sweeping judgment on the basis of these very superficial characteristics. So even if you kind of move past these instants or snapshots which kind of derail people's political careers, you come to ask the question, what is it that we value in leadership? Now, when people were asked what they valued in leadership, they often came back with responses such as charisma or rhetoric, which ostensibly don't really have anything to do with the way that they carry out their job. Now, I know people can make the argument that rhetoric can inspire, can gel the team, and similarly being inspiring is obviously very key in motivation, and I take on board all those arguments. But you'd be interested to know that there's been a recent article talking about how extrovert CEOs are underperforming their introvert counterparts more significantly. So the people who can do really rousing speeches, who can get people to work together in groups, they are underperforming. And I think that's interesting, and it goes back to Plato's original conception of a philosopher king. Would you rather have someone who is focused on the nitty-gritty rather than the television sound bites? But again, I understand that it's not a binary. Let's now talk about selfishness. So this is a pretty tricky thing to explain because we've been brought up both academically and just in general society to kind of do what's best for us. So for example, a rational economic consumer is one that increases his or her own welfare set the most. Or an individual citizen is kind of told to vote for the person that can do the most for him or her. Now, I think that's a pretty corrosive way of viewing society. So, for example, if I'm going to go and place my vote, and the only thing I'm thinking about is whether this politician can give me what I want, that kind of is a very incomplete way of thinking about life, because every day you have interactions or engagements or situations where you have to talk to and work with different members of society. And if you've only looked out for yourself, that means that you've essentially voted in an incomplete way, because I think your vote should be much more consuming or much more encapsulating of your entire existence. Now, inevitably, people have realized that people's lower sentiments are much more rapid in calling people to action than their kind of higher ideals. What I mean by that is that fear is a much bigger motivator than kind of an aspiration towards an innate goodness. So for example, everyone wants to live in a free and fair society, or everyone wants to live in a society with liberty. Everyone wants to live in a society where everyone is doing pretty well. Now, that is obviously a compelling message, but it is not compelling because people fear their current status quo being lowered much more than the promise of a better status quo, because there's kind of a certainty associated with what you can lose that there isn't associated with what you might gain. So I think it's pretty interesting the way that political agents and countries have been able to kind of use this for their own ends. You can see this with the UKIP or Brexit party doing pretty well in constituencies in which there are low numbers of migrants or refugees, but they've been able to stoke up that fear. And that's because politicians have realized pretty well that it's a very well-known human instinct to kind of fear what you could lose rather than be drawn to an aspiration or a dream of what you could achieve. It's pretty much human nature to fear that your status quo could be lowered imminently rather than work towards a future that is pretty uncertain. And I think we have to appeal to that sense of betterment if we're actually going to get past this notion of selfishness. So now let's compare a model of leadership from antiquity to examples of leadership we have in the modern day. So the one I'm putting forward is that of Marcus Aurelius, who says there are 5 facets of what a leader should embody. The first is get along with other people. The second is be hardworking and conscientious. Third, don't seek praise or flatter others. Fourth, don't be afraid of criticism. Fifth, be content with the simple things in life. Now, it's a pretty sad state of affairs because I don't think many of them apply to many leaders in this day and age. Now, that may not necessarily be because of the leaders themselves or just because of the leaders themselves, but generally the trend in which society has traveled. So the first one is getting along with others. Now, it's pretty sad that compromise is now viewed as a pretty dirty word. It's pretty conclusive that Trump and Brexit happened because people didn't view compromise as an ideal. So, for example, compromising with the 27 other EU nations was a no-go. And similarly, people wanted to see Trump as a bulldozing figure or a dictatorial figure who would kind of get the job done after this malaise or this stalemate that people perceived the liberal elite had kind of put forward for the last few decades. Similarly, the don't seek praise and don't be afraid of criticism thing is pretty interesting because this is not just applicable to politicians. I think us as individuals are actually big sufferers of this in everyday life, whether it's because of Instagram, YouTube, other social medias. We have been programmed to kind of be thirsty for these dopamine hits which validate our own existence. Now, it's interesting because none of these things really have anything to do with leadership. So, for example, if Justin Trudeau was to put out a video and get 2 million likes and it was shared and it spread a great message, that's all well and good. But unless that video is going to improve someone's life, who is better off for it? And how many resources do you think actually go into manufacturing the approval of others rather than the actual improvement in their lives? And the final one is interesting. Be content with the simple things in life. Now, I think it would be wrong to kind of allude to the European nations as the best example of this because there are definitely more lavish examples of leadership across the world. But it is definitely not the case that simplicity and kind of plainness or commonality are things that we associate with leadership. Often leadership comes with a lot of strappings of traditions and elegance and pomp and ceremony, but should that be the case? Because there's often the argument made, can you really represent someone if you can't at least empathize with a degree of their existence? And I would argue that there is a strong case that you cannot, and especially if there is a wide enough gulf, why would you be able to empathize with someone you're trying to help? So I hope this is kind of a good rundown of why I think we make poor decisions about our leaders. It was a pretty short video, but I think it was an interesting thought for the day, especially on general election day in which we are choosing our leaders. This is not to say that everyone behaves in this way, it's just I think that society has programmed us into viewing ourselves as very individual creatures, and we only have a very negative way of looking at elections or politicians, whereas if we were to perhaps embody or adopt a more proactive or aspirational approach, we may come to very different conclusions. So thank you for listening, and if you did like this video, please subscribe, and I've got more coming.